North Africa, May 1943. The sun beat down on a landscape of sand and rock where Staff Sergeant Thomas Begay of the United States Army crouched low, pressing his palm against the earth near a rocky outcrop 12 kilometers south of Bizerte. To the officers watching him from a command vehicle, the action seemed absurd. This Apache scout from Arizona, trained in traditional tracking methods passed down through generations, was now tasting the dirt. They believed it was a waste of time, a primitive superstition that had no place in modern mechanized warfare. They were about to discover just how catastrophically wrong they were. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What these officers failed to understand was that Thomas Begay possessed a skill set that would uncover 31 hidden positions of the German armed forces during the war. Positions that aerial reconnaissance, ground patrols, and conventional intelligence had completely missed. His unconventional methods would prove more valuable than entire battalions of regular infantry. Thomas Begay had been recruited into the Army in early 1942, just months after the events at Pearl Harbor. Born on the Fort Apache reservation in Arizona, he had grown up learning the ancient tracking skills of his ancestors. His grandfather, a respected elder who had lived through the transition from the old ways to the modern world, had taught him to read the land like others read books. Every disturbance in the soil, every shifted stone, every bent blade of grass told a story to those who knew how to listen. The Army, in one of its rare moments of strategic brilliance, had recognized the potential value of Native American scouts. While the code talkers from the Navajo Nation would become famous for their communications work in the Pacific, other tribes contributed scouts and trackers to the European and North African campaigns. Thomas was one of 23 Apache scouts assigned to the North African theater, but he would distinguish himself in ways that exceeded all expectations. When Thomas first arrived in North Africa, in February 1943, the campaign was reaching its critical phase. The German forces, under the command of their military leadership at the time, had been pushed into a defensive position in Tunisia, but they remained dangerous and cunning. They had established an elaborate network of defensive positions, many of them expertly camouflaged and virtually invisible to conventional observation. Captain Robert Morrison, the intelligence officer who would become Thomas's primary liaison, initially regarded the Apache scout with barely concealed skepticism. Morrison was a product of West Point, a man who believed in maps, aerial photographs, and established military doctrine. The idea that an indigenous tracker using methods that predated the Roman Empire could contribute anything meaningful to 20th century warfare struck him as absurd. Their first encounter set the tone for what would become a complex but ultimately productive relationship. Morrison had assembled his intelligence team in a dusty tent that served as their operations center. Maps covered every available surface, marked with positions, movements, and the uncertain locations of enemy forces. Thomas, can you explain to us exactly what it is you think you can accomplish here that our reconnaissance aircraft and trained observers cannot? Morrison asked, his voice carrying the careful politeness that often masks contempt. Thomas studied the map before responding. His voice was quiet, but there was absolute certainty in his words. I can tell you where they are hiding, not where we think they are, not where they might be, where they actually are. And how, pray tell, do you propose to do that? Morrison pressed. The same way my grandfather tracked deer in the mountains of Arizona, the same way his grandfather tracked enemy war parties in the time before the reservations, by reading what the land tells me. Morrison exchanged glances with his fellow officers. Lieutenant James Patterson, a younger officer with experience in desert warfare, seemed more intrigued than dismissive. Major William Chen, the operations officer, maintained a neutral expression that suggested he was willing to give the Apache scout a chance. The earth remembers everything, Thomas continued. When men dig into the ground, when they move equipment, when they try to hide their presence, all of it leaves traces. Most people look but do not see. I see what others miss. Very well, Morrison said finally. We have reports of possible enemy positions in Sector 7, about 15 kilometers east of here. Standard patrols have found nothing. Tomorrow morning, you can show us what you can do." That night, Thomas sat outside the camp, looking up at the stars that blazed across the North African sky. They were the same stars that had guided his ancestors across the American Southwest, the same celestial markers that had helped countless generations navigate their world. He thought about his grandfather's words, spoken years ago during a hunting trip in the White Mountains. "The land speaks to those who listen," his grandfather had told him. "Every animal that passes, every plant that grows, every stone that falls, all of it is part of a great conversation. The whites build their machines and think they can ignore this conversation. They are like deaf men at a gathering, missing everything important." Thomas had written those words in a letter home just days before. His letters to his family on the reservation were sparse but heartfelt. He wrote about the alien landscape of North Africa, so different from Arizona, yet similar in its harsh beauty. He wrote about the soldiers he served with, men from every corner of America, each bringing their own skills and backgrounds to the shared struggle. But mostly, he wrote about his determination to honor his people by proving the value of their traditional knowledge. The next morning, Thomas accompanied a patrol led by Lieutenant Patterson into Sector 7. They traveled in a jeep for the first 10 kilometers, then continued on foot when the terrain became too rough. The landscape was a maze of rocky hills, dry wadis, and scattered scrub vegetation, perfect country for concealment. After an hour of walking, Thomas signaled for the patrol to stop. He knelt near what appeared to be an unremarkable patch of ground, studied it for several minutes, then began to examine the surrounding area with intense concentration. The soldiers watched with a mixture of curiosity and impatience as he moved in an expanding spiral, occasionally pausing to examine particular spots more closely. Finally, he returned to where Patterson waited. "There is a position approximately 200 meters to the northeast," Thomas said. "At least one squad, possibly more. They have been there for at least 4 days." Patterson felt a mixture of doubt and hope. "How can you possibly know that?" Thomas pointed to the ground. "The soil here has been disturbed, not recently but within the past week. When you dig, you bring up earth from below the surface. That earth has different moisture, different color, different composition. It weathers differently than the surface soil. Also there are tracks, very faint, very old, but there. Men walking in patterns that soldiers walk, regular intervals, specific routes." "I don't see anything," Patterson admitted. "That is because you are looking for what you expect to see," Thomas replied. "You are looking for obvious signs. I am reading the story the land tells." Thomas bent down and did something that made Patterson's eyes widen. He scooped up a small amount of dirt and tasted it. He moved a few meters away, repeated the process, then a third time in another location. "The taste tells me about metal," Thomas explained, noting Patterson's expression. "When equipment is nearby, when ammunition has been stored, when metal tools have been used extensively, these things change the soil in subtle ways. The compounds leach into the earth. My grandfather taught me this for tracking where deer had bedded down. Their urine changes the taste of the soil. Here, I use it to find where men have placed their war materials." They approached the area Thomas had indicated with extreme caution. Patterson had radioed for additional support, unwilling to walk into a potential ambush based solely on dirt tasting and soil analysis. As they drew closer, one of the soldiers spotted it, the barely visible edge of a camouflage net, so expertly placed that it blended almost perfectly with the surrounding rocks. The position was empty. The German forces had abandoned it recently, probably within the past 12 hours based on the evidence Thomas found. But the discovery proved something crucial. Thomas's methods worked. The position was exactly where he said it would be, constructed exactly as he had described, occupied for almost exactly the time frame he had estimated. Patterson sent an immediate report to Morrison. Within hours, Thomas was testing his methods across multiple sectors. What followed over the next 3 weeks was a systematic demonstration of tracking skills that left the intelligence officers both amazed and humbled. Thomas would arrive at an area, spend time walking the ground, and then produce assessments of remarkable accuracy. He found artillery positions by noting how the recoil from repeated firing had disturbed the soil in distinctive patterns. He located supply dumps by reading the tracks of repeated vehicle visits, even when those visits had occurred weeks earlier, and wind-blown sand had nearly obliterated the evidence. He identified command posts by the subtle patterns of foot traffic. Officers and messengers moved differently than ordinary soldiers, creating signature patterns in the earth. But it was his ability to locate underground bunkers and fortified positions that truly set Thomas apart. The German forces during that era were masters of defensive engineering. They could dig positions that were virtually invisible from the air and extremely difficult to spot on the ground. They used natural features, artificial camouflage, and careful construction to create fortifications that conventional intelligence struggled to identify. Thomas found them by reading what others could not see. When Earth is excavated, even if it is carefully replaced and disguised, it settles differently. It compacts differently. Water drains through it differently. Plants grow in it differently. To most observers, these differences were invisible. To Thomas, trained from childhood to spot the slightest anomaly in the natural order, they were as obvious as signposts. Sergeant First Class Heinrich Wolff commanded one of the defensive positions that Thomas would eventually discover. Wolff was a veteran of campaigns in Poland, France, and the Eastern Front. He had survived 3 years of combat through a combination of skill, caution, and attention to detail. When his unit had been assigned to construct a fortified observation post in the rocky hills south of Bizerte, Wolff had supervised every aspect of the work personally. His diary, discovered after the war, provided insights into the German perspective during this period. In an entry dated April 28, 1943, Wolff wrote about his confidence in the position's concealment. "We have created something that I believe cannot be found by the enemy," he wrote in German. "The bunker is dug into the reverse slope of the hill, with only the observation slits visible, and those are so carefully camouflaged that I myself have difficulty spotting them from 50 meters away. We dispersed the excavated soil across a wide area, mixed it with rocks, and allowed the wind to age it. No aerial observer could possibly identify this position. Ground patrols would need to literally stumble over it to find it." Wolff's confidence was justified by conventional standards. His position had remained undetected for nearly 3 weeks, but he had not accounted for Thomas Bigay. On May 7, 1943, Thomas was examining an area approximately 1 kilometer from Wolff's position. He had been working for 6 hours, moving systematically across terrain that intelligence had flagged as potentially containing enemy positions. The sun was past its zenith, and the heat was intense, but Thomas maintained his methodical approach. He paused at a spot where the ground showed what most would consider nothing unusual. To Thomas, it was a clear indication that something was wrong. The soil here had a different texture, a different compactness. Small rocks had been placed in patterns that looked natural but weren't. They were too regular, too evenly distributed. The vegetation growth was slightly different, the plants responding to the subtle changes in soil composition that excavation and replacement create. Thomas tasted the soil. There was a mineral quality, a sharpness that suggested cement or concrete somewhere below. He moved in a careful pattern, testing multiple locations, building a mental map of the subsurface disturbance. After 40 minutes of analysis, he was confident. "There is a significant fortified position here," he reported to Patterson, who had become his regular companion on these expeditions. "Underground construction, probably concrete reinforcement. Multiple occupants, likely a full squad or more. Observation post with possible artillery direction capabilities, active within the past 24 hours. Patterson no longer questioned these assessments. In the 3 weeks since their first patrol together, Thomas had located 18 positions, and every single one had proven to be exactly as described. Artillery units had been called in to neutralize several. Others had been avoided, their locations noted for future operations. In one case, Thomas's identification of a forward observation post had allowed American forces to feed false information to the enemy by controlling what that post could observe. "This one is important," Thomas added. "The amount of work that went into it, the quality of the concealment. This is not a routine position. Someone with experience and skill built this. They called in a full platoon and approached with extreme caution." Wolff's position, which he had been so certain could not be found, was about to be discovered by a method he had never imagined, an Apache scout from Arizona, tasting the dirt. The American forces surrounded the position and called for surrender. Wolf, realizing that continued resistance was pointless once the position was compromised, ordered his men to lay down their arms. As he emerged from the bunker, blinking in the bright sunlight, he saw Thomas standing near the entrance. "How did you find us?" Wolf asked in heavily accented English. "We took every precaution, every single precaution." Patterson, who had learned some German during his intelligence training, translated Thomas's response. He said the Earth told him you were here. Wolf looked at the Apache scout with an expression that mixed respect and disbelief. The Earth, Thomas explained through Patterson's translation, some of the methods he had used. As he described the soil analysis, the pattern recognition, the taste testing, Wolf's expression changed from disbelief to fascination. "In my country, we have forgotten such skills," Wolf said quietly. "We build machines, we trust in technology, we think ourselves superior because of our modern methods. And then I am defeated by a man tasting dirt. There is a lesson in this, though I am not certain what it is." The capture of Wolf's position was significant for several reasons. The observation post had been providing crucial intelligence about American movements. Documents found in the bunker revealed plans for a coordinated response to the expected Allied assault on Axis positions. The loss of this position degraded the German forces' ability to monitor and respond to Allied operations. But perhaps more importantly, the method of its discovery represented a fundamental shift in how the American command viewed Thomas's contributions. Captain Morrison, who had been skeptical from the beginning, became one of Thomas's strongest advocates. In a report dated May 10, 1943, Morrison wrote with evident amazement about Thomas's capabilities. "Sergeant Bigay has demonstrated tracking and analytical skills that exceed anything I have witnessed in my military career," Morrison stated. "His methods appear primitive on first examination, but the results are consistently accurate and remarkably detailed. He can determine not only the location of enemy positions, but also their purpose, garrison strength, and duration of occupation. I have recommended him for immediate commendation and suggest that his techniques be studied for possible application across other theaters." Major Chen, the operations officer, went further. In a classified memo to higher command, Chen proposed recruiting and training additional Native American scouts, using Thomas's methods as a model. "If one man can locate 18 confirmed enemy positions in 3 weeks using traditional tracking techniques," Chen wrote, "imagine what a dozen trained scouts could accomplish. We have been so focused on technological solutions, aerial reconnaissance, electronic intelligence, signals intercept, that we have overlooked the value of fundamental human skills refined over centuries." The proposal went nowhere initially. The military bureaucracy moved slowly, and by the time the recommendations reached decision-makers with authority to implement them, the North African campaign was entering its final phase. But the seed had been planted, and after the war some of these ideas would influence how the military thought about reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. Thomas continued his work through May and into early June. By the time the North African campaign concluded, he had identified 31 enemy positions of various types. His success rate remained extraordinary. Every position he identified proved to be exactly where he said it would be. Constructed, as he described, used for the purposes he assessed. The 31st and final position Thomas discovered was in many ways the most impressive. Intelligence had reports of a major German command center somewhere in the hills northwest of Tunis. Multiple patrols had searched the area without success. Aerial reconnaissance had photographed the region extensively, but found nothing. The command center, if it existed, was a ghost. Thomas spent 2 full days examining the area. Unlike his previous searches, which had usually yielded results within hours, this one proved more challenging. The position, if it was there, had been constructed with extraordinary care. Finally, on the evening of the second day, Thomas found the telltale signs. The clues were subtle: a drainage pattern that didn't quite match the natural contours of the land, vegetation that showed signs of transplanting rather than natural growth, soil that had been so carefully aged and disguised that only the most minute examination revealed its disturbance. "He is here," Thomas reported to Morrison, pointing to a hillside that looked entirely natural. Major installation, probably 20 or more personnel. Significant underground construction, communication equipment based on the electromagnetic traces in the soil, multiple entrances and exits. Morrison looked at the hillside and saw nothing unusual. After 3 weeks of watching Thomas work, he had learned to trust the Apache Scouts' assessments, but this one seemed impossible. The hillside looked completely undisturbed. "How confident are you?" Morrison asked. "Completely confident," Thomas replied. "This is the most carefully hidden position I have found. Whoever built this understood concealment at the highest level, but they could not hide everything. The Earth always remembers. The assault on the position was planned carefully. If Thomas was correct, this was a significant target. If he was wrong, and despite his perfect record, Morrison allowed for the possibility, they would expend considerable resources for nothing." Thomas was not wrong. The command center was there, exactly as he had described. When American forces moved in, they discovered a sophisticated underground complex that had been directing defensive operations across a broad sector. Maps, communication equipment, intelligence files, all of it fell into American hands intact. The German officer who surrendered the position, a colonel whose name was recorded but is not relevant to this narrative, asked the same question that Wolfe had asked weeks earlier. "How did you find us?" This time Thomas gave a more complete answer. "My people have lived on the land for thousands of years," he explained through a translator. "We survived because we learned to read what others could not see. Every animal that passed, every change in the weather, every shift in the earth, all of it mattered. Those who could not read these signs did not survive. Those who could became the ancestors of people like me." The colonel listened with the expression of a man whose entire worldview was being challenged. "We have science," he said. "We have engineering. We have the most advanced military in the world." "And yet you are defeated by a man tasting dirt," Thomas replied, deliberately echoing Wolfe's words from weeks earlier. "Perhaps that should tell you something about the limits of science without wisdom." The North African campaign ended on May 13, 1943, with the surrender of the remaining Axis forces in Tunisia. Thomas's contributions were recognized in official reports, though the full details of his methods remained somewhat classified. The military, even in commending him, seemed uncertain how to categorize skills that predated modern warfare by millennia. Thomas received the Bronze Star for meritorious service. The citation was carefully worded to acknowledge his achievements without going into detail about his methods. In the world of military bureaucracy, there was no established category for what Thomas had done. He was not a conventional scout. He was not an intelligence analyst in the usual sense. He was something the modern military had no framework for, a bridge between ancient knowledge and contemporary warfare. After the North African campaign concluded, Thomas was assigned to training duties. For several months he worked with intelligence personnel, attempting to teach them the fundamentals of his tracking methods. The results were mixed. Some students showed aptitude, particularly those who had grown up in rural areas or had hunting experience. Others, raised in cities and trained in conventional military methods, struggled to unlearn their assumptions about what observation meant. The challenge, Thomas explained to one frustrated student, is that you are looking for specific things. You have a mental checklist, tracks, disturbed ground, obvious signs. But tracking is not about looking for things. It is about seeing everything and noticing what does not fit. It is about reading patterns, not searching for details. The student, a bright young officer from Boston, had difficulty grasping the concept. "Can you be more specific? What exactly should I look for?" Thomas smiled, recognizing the fundamental disconnect. "If I tell you what to look for, you will look for those things and miss everything else. You must learn to see without looking, to observe without searching. It is like hearing music. You do not listen for specific notes, you hear the whole melody." In November 1943, Thomas was reassigned to the European theatre. He spent the winter of 1943 to 1944 in Italy, where he applied his skills in the mountainous terrain of the Italian peninsula. The environment was different from North Africa, but the fundamental principles remained the same. The earth remembered everything, and Thomas could read its memories. He served through the Italian campaign and into the final push through France and into Germany during the conflict's closing phase. In each theater, he identified positions, assessed enemy movements, and provided intelligence that saved lives and contributed to tactical successes. The exact number of positions he located throughout his service was never officially tallied, but estimates suggest it exceeded 100. When the conflict in Europe ended in May 1945, Thomas returned to the United States. He was discharged with honors and returned to the Fort Apache reservation in Arizona. He rarely spoke about his service, following a pattern common among his generation of veterans. The skills that had made him exceptional in wartime were skills he had possessed all along. They were simply the skills his grandfather had taught him, applied in a different context. In the years after his return, Thomas lived quietly. He worked various jobs, raised a family, and participated in community life on the reservation. Occasionally, military historians or researchers would contact him, wanting to document his methods or understand his achievements. He was polite, but generally uninterested in these inquiries. "There is nothing mysterious about what I did," he told one researcher in the 1960s. "I used the skills my people have always had. The only unusual thing was that the Army recognized the value of those skills. For most of history, the whites dismissed native knowledge as primitive. During the conflict, they needed it. After the conflict, they mostly forgot about it again." Captain Morrison, who had been so skeptical at first, remained in contact with Thomas for years after the conflict ended. In a letter written in 1958, Morrison reflected on what he had learned from working with the Apache Scout. "Thomas taught me that modern does not always mean better," Morrison wrote. "He taught me that centuries of accumulated wisdom have value that technology cannot replace. Most importantly, he taught me humility. I thought my education, my training, my modern methods made me superior. Thomas showed me that I was blind to things that were obvious to someone with different knowledge, different training, different ways of seeing the world." The broader military, however, was slower to internalize these lessons. The decades following the conflict saw an increasing emphasis on technological solutions to military challenges. Satellites replaced aerial reconnaissance, electronic sensors replaced human observers, computer analysis replaced intuitive assessment. In this environment, skills like Thomas's seemed increasingly irrelevant. Yet periodically, usually after some technological system failed to detect a well-hidden enemy position, military planners would rediscover the value of traditional tracking skills. Programs would be initiated to train scouts in observation techniques. Experts would be consulted about pattern recognition and environmental analysis. These initiatives would generate reports and recommendations, then quietly fade away when the immediate problem was solved or when budget pressures demanded cuts to specialized programs. Thomas died in 1989 at the age of 71. His obituary in the local Arizona newspaper mentioned his military service but gave no details about his specific contributions. To most people, including many in his own community, he was simply a veteran who had served his country and returned home to live a quiet life. But among those who had served with him, who had watched him work, who had seen enemy positions appear as if by magic, simply because a quiet Apache scout had tasted the dirt and read the land, Thomas Bigay was remembered differently. He was the man who proved that ancient wisdom could defeat modern fortifications, that traditional skills could outperform contemporary technology, that knowledge passed down through generations could be as valuable as any weapon invented in the 20th century. The 31 hidden positions he discovered in North Africa were just the beginning. Over the course of his military service, Thomas applied skills that his culture had refined over thousands of years to challenges that the modern world believed required modern solutions. He did not invent new techniques or develop revolutionary methods. He simply used what his grandfather had taught him, what his grandfather's grandfather had taught before that, stretching back through generations to a time when reading the land meant the difference between survival and death. In doing so, he demonstrated a truth that military organizations continually forget and rediscover. That wisdom is not the same as knowledge, that seeing is not the same as looking, and that sometimes the most advanced solution to a problem is to remember what has always been known. The German officers who surrendered to Allied forces often asked the same question. How were they found when they had been so careful, so thorough in their concealment? The answer was always the same, and it always surprised them. An Apache scout from Arizona had tasted the dirt and read their secrets in the soil. In a world of radar and sonar, of aerial reconnaissance and signals intelligence, of computers and satellites, this seemed impossible. But Thomas understood something that the modern world struggles to accept. The Earth keeps no secrets from those who know how to listen. Every footstep, every excavation, every attempt at concealment leaves traces that persist long after the immediate evidence has faded. These traces cannot be hidden from someone with the knowledge to read them. The skeptical officers who had dismissed Thomas's methods as primitive superstition learned a lesson that echoes across time. Traditional knowledge is not inferior knowledge, it is different knowledge, refined through centuries of application and survival. To dismiss it as outdated is to throw away accumulated wisdom that might prove invaluable when modern systems fail. Thomas Bigay, tasting dirt on a North African hillside, embodied this truth. His grandfather would have understood exactly what he was doing and why it worked. The German engineers who built fortifications according to the most advanced principles of their era could not fathom how their positions were being discovered. The answer lay in the gap between technological sophistication and experiential wisdom, a gap that Thomas bridged with skills that predated civilization itself. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.